All right, we did it. The button pressing has commenced, and a time-space link has been generated between the sound of my voice and the cave of your ear. This is Jay Brown Yoga Talks podcast. My name is Jay Brown, and I'm grateful to you, whoever you are, for choosing to listen to this today. I hope this moment finds you feeling reasonably well. I wonder what it's like for you right now, whoever you are, as you listen to this. How much farther in the future from the moment in which I'm recording it is, or even what's the weather like? As I sit here, there is a fierce wind blowing. And I mean that literally, as I can hear it whipping against the roof of my attic. But I also mean it in a more metaphoric way as well, because there does seem to be a fierce wind that has blown through the yoga world and beyond. But you know, I largely concern myself with the yoga world here on this show. And if you've been around, you know I've been talking about reconciling the way that previously established career paths for yoga teachers have been all but decimated in the last few years. And I've been reaching out and connecting with a number of other folks who are in a similar boat to me in one way or another. And in connecting with them, it's made even more clear that I'm not imagining this, that this is definitely the case. Not only does it have to do with career paths, it has also to do with very deep spiritual questions about what yoga teaches, about making meaning and reconciling the seeming contradictions that one encounters when you look to understand or learn yoga, particularly when you're a Westerner who doesn't come from that culture, in the midst of the modern postural yoga wave or whatever I don't even know what to call it, but that way that yoga came into the mainstream of our culture and the nature of a yoga inquiry and where that might lead someone. So I say all this because I've really been grappling. I've been grappling with some deep questions on both a personal spiritual level and then also now on a professional level. And that's what we're going to be talking about today with my guest, Cindy Lusk. Cindy is someone who has listened to the show, and we've had some email exchanges over the years. She recently wrote a book called Align and Refine, and she sent it to me, and she was someone who was looking back and reflecting on many of the same things that I have. So it was really a pleasure and very affirming to get a chance to speak with her. I'm very happy to be sharing that with you today. Before we get to that, let me mention that I have an upcoming in-person event in Austin, Texas, May 4th and 5th. If you live in Austin or you can get to Austin and you would have interest in getting together with me for some practice and some discussion about things that feel important to us, I would love for you to be there. That's May 4th and 5th in Austin, Texas. I also have a newly released on-demand video course called the Yoga Modules that I think is definitely worth your while. I also have a range of other stuff, ongoing live classes, a weekly discussion group, a whole bunch of other stuff too. If you want to connect with me outside of just listening to this show, the best way to do that is go to jbrownyoga.com. Okay, what else? There's so many things that are sort of percolating. As I said, I've been grappling with a lot. It's almost too much. It's like now doesn't feel like the right moment to get into any of it. So I think we're just going to keep it short and sweet and leave it there. I will touch base with you on the other side, but let's go ahead and get into this conversation that I had with Cindy Lusk. Hello?
Hello.
Hello, Cindy.
Hi, Jay.
Hi, nice to meet you voice to voice.
Yes, we've had a few emails, but it's nice to be here.
Very cool. I know that you know the deal, but just to say I'm already recording, so let's consider ourselves having just begun.
Okay, great. I'm a big fan of the podcast, so I'm just really delighted to be here to add to the conversation today.
Well, I really appreciate your book that you sent me. Let's say the title of it, Align and Refine, The Journey of Yoga and Meditation. And I have to tell you, I mean, the title's a little bit deceiving because, because when I saw the words align and refine, the first thing that came to my mind was, oh, this is going to be an asana book.
Yeah.
Because, alignment and the refinement of alignment, those words, that's what my mind went to. But your book is not at all an asana book. It's a very deep dive into yoga philosophy.
Yes, it's mostly about meditation, quite honestly.
Yes.
But I started, like many people, in the asana world. So, in a way, it's a little bit of a double entendre, I guess.
I get it. Once I started reading the book, the entendre became very clear. What else I would say is I also understand maybe why you listen to the show or why you reached out to me about coming on the show, because there really was a very clear parallel in what you did in your book and like some of the conversations I've been having, and I'd say more importantly, my experience of being a teacher and processing that over 20, 30 years now. And I would say that maybe there's a cutoff, it's like generations, there's one or two generations, maybe three, I guess, of people who got into yoga before there was yoga teacher trainings, and you pursued it on your own, like you had to seek it out a little bit more still.
Yes. I think you and I are of a similar generation from what I've heard. I think I'm about 5 years, before you. I started on my path, I started in 1985. And so it's been a whole thing. And that's why I wrote the book, is because, as I explain in the book, I was so confused about what is yoga and kind of the disconnect between what we do on the mat, especially as I started out in Ashtanga yoga, a very rigorous practice, and and then being pointed to these texts like the Yoga Sutra and trying to understand what that had to do with, putting my foot behind my head.
Yeah, and I will throw into that, which we can get to today, the sort of having to understand in order to reconcile seeming contradictions between classical yoga and tantra. And sort of an understanding, people have interpreted sutras in both ways,
Exactly.
So to kind of be clear, to understand, what's the belief that I have, or what's the value I have? Because within yoga, there are pretty varied viewpoints that one might adopt,
Yes, and that's what I didn't understand at first. because, there's a very, very long history of yoga and yoga philosophy, and each, school comes along and adopts what they like from the previous one, rejects what they don't like and adds to it. And, it's part of the refinement process, really, as it's gone through the years. So sometimes you'll end up with very contradictory messages. At least that was my experience. And I think another big point that I make in the book that I think relates to what you're saying, and I think is important, and why I think it's so confusing for many people, is this distinction between, a renunciate path and a householder path.
Mm-hmm.
Because, the Yoga Sutra really is a renunciate text.
Well, some would interpret it differently, but I think that you could certainly make a strong case, in particular if you're like looking at it from a very academic standpoint, philologically or whatever. Like at the time it was written, the consensus is that it was.
Yes, and it can be interpreted differently as it has been.
Yes.
But along with that is the idea that there are renunciate practices and householder practices, and they have different goals. One is to withdraw from society and really kind of, stop your mind.
Mm-hmm. To put it simply, okay, yes.
Yeah, and the other is to have a practice that actually supports your efficacy in the world, which is more of a householder path and practice.
Now, what's interesting about what you're saying to me, when you're saying that there are certain practices that have certain purposes baked into them, which I think is largely true. And I would even put it in the way that it's been my experience that the viewpoint that the teacher holds, whether or not it is conscious or not, is going to color the practice that happens.
To be sure. And that's, when I went to Mysore for the first time in 1990 and was in the, Patabhi Jois's first shala, a very small room, right there on the wall is Shankaracharya. That's his lineage, which, Shankaracharya established, basically monasteries, several of them. And it was more of a renunciatory path. And so I think that practice has a bit of an aspect of kind of controlling the body, like a domination even. So I think that, yes, for sure.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but what's so interesting to me about that is I saw in your bio that you studied with Richard Freeman and even maybe did some teaching at the yoga workshop. And I went there once in 1995. My dad lived in Boulder, like a 10-minute walk from the yoga workshop. And Richard Freeman was one of the first teachers who his instruction to me was to smile while I was practicing.
Yes.
Which became a huge... It sounds so silly now, but like at the time I was working so hard to do everything right and climb the 8 lemmed rungs up to the samadhi goal or whatever I was trying to do. And that instruction he gave me was the beginning of me finding my way to a much gentler and different orientation practice. Mm-hmm. But he was teaching the Ashtanga Vinyasa system and still does. Do you think that Richard would say that the Ashtanga Vinyasa system is inherently about dominating the body?
No, I don't think he would. I mean, I feel very fortunate that is who I started with.
Yeah.
And by the way, I'm not sure he would say he's teaching Ashtanga anymore.
Oh, you're right. He might not be saying that. Last time he came on, we just talked about the Bhagavad Gita the whole time.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not really sure. But anyway, you'd have to ask him about that. But he, I think
you get the point of my question, though, right?
Yes, I do. Yeah, I think he got actual flack from the Ashtanga world, some parts of the Ashtanga world, for being, less of a fundamentalist. I mean, he wrote an article in the Yoga Journal many, many years ago about fundamentalism, and and I think that's kind of a tension that runs in the Ashtanga world. But I think the practice in general is one more of really, a harsher control of the body. At least that's what it felt like in my body, having sustained many injuries from that practice.
Right. And it also seems to me that what I followed in your book and was also true for me is that at a certain point when like the physical practices might even be causing you some pain, as was in my case, because really being so hard on my body.
Mm-hmm.
And then when you start to branch out and like study different types of practice and learn about different systems, you start to wonder, well, why are these practices so different from, they all called yoga, but they're so different. And then that inherently leads to a consideration of history and philosophy, it seems like.
Yeah.
You got to figure out where stuff's coming from, and that's why it is the way it is, Yeah. And I noticed. What were you going to say? Go ahead.
Well, I just for me, I was kind of uncomfortable with that. I mean, I ran around for many years asking every teacher I could, if the whole idea is to kind of leave the thoughts and mind behind and kind of control the mind and body, then why were we given this body and mind that is so active? It's such a disconnect for me. And that's why when I did find, discover that, wow, there was an evolution of yoga philosophy beyond classical yoga, namely Tantra and other lineages, it just sort of felt more intuitive to me. It rested better with me in my heart. It felt like it made more sense to me intuitively.
And just to go back for a second, what was your experience of Patabhi Jois? How many times did you go there? Did you interact with him directly? What were your impressions of him as a teacher at the time?
Well, I mean, he came, I actually started with Richard before he was teaching Ashtanga yoga.
Whoa. Really? What was he teaching before Ashtanga?
Well, it was more of an Iyengar type yoga. And then, and this was before the yoga workshop. And he, he rented out various spaces around Boulder. And I remember distinctly, Richard you'd find him back in those days by finding a poster,
like at the coffee shop or the grocery store or something on the board, right?
Exactly. And then he would disappear for months at a time. And then, and then you'd see a poster as like, oh, Richard's back, and, and I remember distinctly, and he would often do a workshop when he came back. And I remember distinctly this time when all of a sudden we were doing all this jumping, around stuff that none of us had ever seen before. And he had, started studying with Patabhi Jois. And he took us very, very quickly through the first series and so on. And then in 1989, Patabhi Jois came to the United States. And I think he made 3 stops, Boulder, Encinitas, and Hawaii. And when Patabhi Jois came, that was the first time I met him. And he just seemed like a sweet, kind of jolly person. His English isn't the best. And he told everybody, oh, you come India. And so many of us did trot off to India the following year. So 1990 was the first time I went. And, it was just him teaching. And I think at the time I was there was like, 12 or 15 people, not very many people. And then, he kind of lives up to the reputation to the degree that he gives a lot of deep adjustments, which, is both
so he wasn't
positive
like a sweet old guy when he was teaching. He was cranking you into stuff.
Yes, exactly. And in the Mysore, everyone does their own thing, and he just comes around and adjusts everybody. Right. And, and then there are particular poses that he always adjusts people in.
And honestly, that became a very I mean, I don't know how much we want to get into it, but that was a huge thing. I had all these people on. Karen Rain was on to talk about
Yes.
all the
Mhm.
inappropriate adjustments that were
Yes.
happening.
Yes, exactly.
Did you
And
experience that, or did you witness that?
well, I'll be honest and say that for myself, I was always kind of just barely hanging on physically because the
Yeah.
practice is so demanding.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was always so deep into my breath and just trying to, do the things. And the room, it was just really intense, especially in India. And so I would believe that he inappropriately touched me, but I think that I was so,
Dissociated or whatever.
Yes, exactly. Because, a lot of, part of what he does always are these dropbacks at the end, which terrified me, dropping into Urdhva Dhanurasana from standing.
Mm.
And I completely had to leave my body to do that, which isn't a positive thing at all, of course. But so, yeah, there was a fair amount of dissociation. So, nonetheless, there was something very, very positive I was getting from the practice. There was something about the Ashtanga practice with the focus on the breath and a steady gaze and,
Right.
Kind of a set sequence that allowed you to move into kind of a meditative state. And that's where I, started to have some.
Yes, I mean, I think it's a great system. I mean, it was for me. I mean, I know people are listening to this who are like into Ashtanga, and I is not my intention to like bash the system. I know many people who still practice the primary series to this day and love it and get what they need from it.
Mm-hmm.
I guess
exactly. And I still, like even though I ended up for a variety of reasons switching over to Anusara yoga, which is a whole other story.
Well, we can get to that. I will want to say one other thing before we get there, though, is that I think that practice, as you were just referring to, really was effective for me in kind of cultivating certain discipline, concentration, kind of like stamina, but it was at a price.
Yeah, exactly. But what I was going to say is, I shifted to Anusara, and then now I kind of came back around to a lot of the Ashtanga attributes. I always felt it was important to have a focus on the breath, especially as a teacher, because I have felt that it allows students to start to access some deeper layer, than the body. And it takes the awareness in, and it gives you a point of focus. So I always feel that that's a really, really valuable part of the practice.
I think that's true. And we can come back to that in terms of the technicalities of breath in asana, but it also struck me when I was looking at your bio that it mentioned that you had a history as a deadhead. And so kind of coming from, like an experience with Patabhi Jois, and kind of that's such a wild contradiction between like Richard Freeman teaching you primary series and then Patabhi Jois teaching you primary series. I imagine those are two very different experiences.
Yes.
And then you want to, I don't know, you're exploring outward and you've got the deadhead background. It makes sense that Anusara is where you land, because John Friend was really kind of offering folks like a more, I don't know how to say, open or like a free area of inquiry, because it was like embracing although it started out as one, like Kashmir Shaivism more specifically, and then he kind of rewrote it later. I've had some people on in the years past to talk about what happened there. So how did you end up meeting John Friend and getting involved with Anusara?
Through Richard.
Was Richard practicing with John Friend, or they just like knew each other?
They were friends. They knew each other. In fact, I think that original time that I think both, I'm not sure about this, but I think both John and Richard met Patabhi Jois at Feathered Pipe, and did workshop with him. They were both doing Iyengar. I think they knew each other from the Iyengar community prior to that. And then Richard shifted to doing the Ashtanga. John stayed with the Iyengar and was progressing up the ladder with that. And Richard had John come teach workshops. And it was kind of a similar thing where, he came and he was teaching Iyengar, and then he started, he would come again and it would be something different. And so I think he had a similar experience with the Iyengar tradition of it being kind of very disciplinarian and not heart-centered. And, John was, as well, as you may know, affiliated with the Siddha Yoga and Guru Mahāya Chinvilasananda. And I think from that, he started, getting, desiring a softer approach. And I think that's where he started hooking into the philosophy of Tantra and Kashmir Shaivism and so on.
And, I don't know that everyone listening to this might have a sense of, I don't know how significant John Friend was in a way, because prior to that, maybe it was happening and I just didn't know, but I don't recall a lot of people who were kind of overtly hybriding. Like the way that you had credibility in a way was to be like citing your teacher or what tradition you were from. And everybody, and still to this day, a lot of people still, it's very much about being true to what your teacher taught you. I just teach what my teacher taught me. And they're sort of like taking themselves out of it. And John Friend was like, I'm going to take Iyengar practice, but I'm going to have Tantra philosophy in it, which was not what Mr. Iyengar was teaching, Right. And he made a huge empire or whatever. And that I remember looking at a Yoga Journal magazine and it said, choose your style. And it had a picture of Mr. Iyengar and said Iyengar. It had a picture of Patabhi Jois. It said Ashtanga. It even had a picture of Desa Kachar, and strangely enough said yoga therapy, which is another conversation. Yeah. But there was a picture of John Friend there, like this American guy or whatever, this white guy, along with the Indian masters. And I remember thinking, wow, look at like the potential of what a yoga teacher could do or something. You could make your own thing. And prior to that, I don't know that there was a lot of examples of that.
Yeah. Well, I think it's challenging when any teacher, decides that they are ready to shift away from their teacher for whatever reason. And you have to somehow, I think with John's case, I think he really honored Iyengar, and he was no longer teaching Iyengar. And so he had to come up with some name for it to distinguish it, to be clear that he was no longer Iyengar. And I think that happens to a lot of people along the way.
Right. And it also seems to me that it's interesting, we were talking at the beginning about how practices might have a certain amount of like, what do we call it, dominating the body built into it or something, depending on like its philosophical backgrounds or its kind of context. And so if you have experiences with Patabhi Jois, you're getting like one end of the spectrum maybe. And then John Friend was kind of in the middle, because the philosophical teachings and like the rhetoric of the practice was certainly much less dogmatic or something, or much more about, like you were saying, much more geared towards living harmoniously in your life rather than trying to transcend it. However, I don't know that what was happening on the mat always really connected to what the rhetoric was. It was sort of in the middle. And then I read that you studied with Paul Muller-Ortega of Blue Throat Yoga, and the way that you described it was that it didn't require concentration or controlling the mind, which is sort of the other end of the spectrum. If Patabhi Jois and Ashtanga Yoga is all about stopping the mind, as you said at the very beginning, it seems like Blue Throat Yoga is the other end. I don't know much about Paul Muller-Ortega. Maybe you could say something about him. that
Yes,
practice.
I'd be delighted to. So what's interesting is that when I dove into Anusara, and one of the reasons I did is because it helped heal my body. Because I was at a place with the Ashtanga system that I felt like I couldn't do yoga anymore. Like it just hurt too much.
Mm-hmm.
And John really helped me be able to do the yoga. And it was kind of like philosophically, there was almost a negation of classical yoga and an embrace of Tantra, specifically, more of a Kashmir Shaivite approach and a non-dual philosophy rather than a dual philosophy. I mean, the first, principle of Anusara is open to grace.
Mm.
And as I mentioned in the book, what I felt was missing from both these systems was meditation. I mean, it was kind of assumed that you were meditating. You were supposed to be meditating. In fact, an Anusara teacher is supposed to teach meditation, even though it was never really taught to us. And so Blue Throat Yoga, I met Paul Muller through John, and because he would invite him to some of his gatherings and workshops. And, my mother passed away, and I was just I had been spending a lot of energy caretaking her and then dealing with the aftermath of her death. And I was ready to do something different, really. And I decided to sign up for a program with Paul, which is all about meditation. And the reason I brought up Patanjali again is that eventually Paul brought me back to Patanjali
Mm-hmm.
because, as you know, Vyasa, the commentator of the Yoga Sutra, says yoga is samadhi, which is the state that you cultivate in meditation. So Paul is a amazing academic practitioner. He's left academia to teach, so he could teach meditation more freely. It's hard to do that if you're an academic. And and so he brings a beautiful blend of, being a scholar and many, many years a practitioner. He was originally a student of Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, and as well, he spent many years in that system, and then also with Guru Mai. So he considers those two to be his primary teachers, and he just founded this school called Blue Throat Yoga, which is a school of meditation. So, but it's tantric based. So,
and when you say a school of meditation, is it aligned with you said it's tantric, is it aligned with a particular tradition, or what form does it take? Is it mantras? Is it imagery? Is it just sitting with your breath, or is there specific techniques or specific kind of protocols or a system to it?
It's a very traditional initiation-based school, and it is a mantra-based meditation. So you learn the meditation, and as well, there are ample opportunity, to the degree people desire, to learn, to study, swadhyaya, really, to study. And then, there are many, many affiliated practices of japa and chanting and different practices we do on retreats and so forth. So, that's in a nutshell, a little bit more about that.
Yes. And, I was thinking about what you said before when you talked about how meeting John and Anusara yoga healed your body, and you connected that to a tantric rather than a classical viewpoint. And I'm curious, what do you think it is that was the shift? So other than just pushing hard on your body, or what was different about the practice and what's different about the philosophy that helped you heal?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm not so sure that the philosophy helped me, was part of the healing process of my body. I mean, I'm sure it was to some degree,
Right.
but mostly it was the alignment principles.
I see.
So
just being more conscious about what you're doing with your body, or because in
right.
the early days he had all the spirals and stuff, and then later he renounced it or whatever, or the
Yes,
universal alignments. He let go of the universal alignment. There was like one right alignment at the beginning or something.
Yes, it's funny. It's funny. Well, and I think there was a little bit of understanding about the idea of the universal principles of alignment, because there was a framework, and kind of a recipe in a way, but really varied by individual, so what particular ingredients each individual needed to bring their body into alignment, I think was very, variable.
I see. I get that. And I also took note that you were involved with the teacher training certificate committee at Anusara, which I would note back in the day, I remember when I first there was even the thought in my mind of yoga teacher trainings, kind of before when they first started, really. When someone asked me, I would often recommend Anusara because it was the most extensive one. They had this big manual. You had to do a lot of stuff. It was way more rigorous than some of these other trainings that were coming about, So how involved were you with that program? And I don't know, what was your role in it?
Well, just to back up just a little bit, to reiterate what you just said, I started teaching Ashtanga yoga, after my second trip to India in 94. I wrote a letter to Richard and said, after 9 years, I think I'm ready to start teaching. And he was very supportive of that. And, but sometimes when I went to go try and find a job teaching elsewhere, they wanted to know if I had a teaching certificate. And I did not. And that's actually why I pursued Anusara, in part, was to get trained as a teacher. So I was still practicing and teaching Ashtanga when I did my Anusara teacher training. And I kind of did a hybrid for a while of using the alignment principles to teach, yoga asana. And Anusara developed, as it developed into what I think is a very good model, where they had first what they called immersions, which was learning about yoga.
Right.
Then teacher training was a separate thing to learn about how to teach, because there are, teaching skills that are very important. And, that's why I think the Anusara, as you were saying, was a very good approach, because before you could go to a teacher training, you had to know something about yoga, which I don't know that that's true in a lot of teacher trainings right now. That, you can walk into a 200-hour teacher training without really having practiced yoga very much these days. It's kind of
it's true. And but I will say that, it's such a mixed bag, though. That's all true what you said, but it also got real big and it went south, because it became weird gatekeeping, and John later on blackballing people because they were going off and doing their own things. It got hairy, didn't it?
To be sure. And that's, what for me, I was on the Anusara certification committee, which meant that I reviewed people's videos. So people had to submit a video of themselves teaching.
And this was before there was online yoga, you know?
Right. And
people were like doing it with a video camera or whatever.
Right. Exactly.
VHS or something.
I'd get these DVDs in the mail.
DVDs by that point, okay.
Yeah. And so there was a whole bunch of us who reviewed these, and basically we would, evaluate whether it was up to par or give specific feedback on what needed to be improved.
I'm sorry, I'm trying to interrupt you. Was there a criteria, or your just own subjective view based on your experience?
There was a criteria.
Yeah.
There were criteria. No, whether they were, articulating correctly the principles of alignment, there was a matter of theming. That was really big in Anusara, is bringing in some Dharma teaching and carrying it through the whole class and so forth, so that people could embody it. And through that process is when I started to become very disenchanted with Anusara.
Almost everyone I've talked to over the years who's done teacher trainings have gotten disenchanted, just to say.
Yeah. Well, it's, I felt like there was a lot of, there was a lot of unclarity, and John, I think honestly, Anusara got too much for John in a way, and he couldn't either delegate or decide things.
Right.
So it could be.
Were you close with him? How was your relationship to him?
Well, I was close enough because, I had known him for so many years, and I had known him before, Anusara, and I had, I also with Richard, I worked for Richard, helping manage the studio to some degree. Mm-hmm. And so I, met John like at Richard's house, and and I studied very extensively with John early on before things got big. So yes, I knew him to a degree.
Yeah, I mean, I do think like a lot of all the traditions really, like you said, you talk about Patabhi Jois and being in a room with 15 people, or people like being in living rooms with Mr. Iyengar in London or whatever. Mm-hmm. John, it got so big, he really became like an example of the charismatic male yoga teacher getting put on pedestals. Did you see that? Like all the way that people would fawn over John when it got really big.
Yes.
It seems like it went sour,
Exactly. So when it fell apart, it was kind of okay with me because I was kind of ready.
I've talked to other people though. The part of the issue is they did have like a community. Like people had their careers built on, I'm a Anusara teacher. And then when Anusara suddenly, seemingly overnight, became completely and utterly discredited.
Yes.
People's whole identities were ripped away in a sense. It took people
and livelihood.
Yeah, both.
Yeah, exactly. And, I had at that time been studying with Paul for a long time. So I had that as something that really helped ground me through that whole process.
I could see that you had samadhi and divinity on your side.
Well, I mean, and that is what, again, coming back to the title of the book, when you're aligned with something higher than your surface reality, that can help guide you and kind of support you through anything.
That's true. And I mean, I guess that's an interesting point, because I've had a similar journey in that as you sort through the physical practices and making them work, and then finally giving yourself permission to like not have to do all the things necessarily, or finding teachers. Interestingly enough, Desikachara, who I became very inspired by, it was all about adapting it to your individual needs. Mm-hmm. But it seems like eventually it does become about like navigating an inner landscape. And so when everybody says that the reason you do the asana, the pranayama is to prepare you to sit or whatever, I remember like really not getting that or being. If you are hearing this message, then you're listening to the free version of J. Brown Yoga Talks. To hear the rest of our conversation, please subscribe to Podcast Premium at jbrownyoga.com/premium.